Now, please join me in welcoming Kimberlé Crenshaw and Rebecca Traister.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm going to start by asking, I don't know whether any of you spotted her, but Kimberlé Crenshaw is in that movie because you were there in that room. And I want to start by asking you what your memories of it were living through it, in it, at the time.
Well, I was there. I had gone there to assist the legal team. I'd been doing some research on an article that I was writing called Mapping the Margins. And in that article, I was writing about sexual and physical violence against women of color and focusing on some of the ways that although all women face the threat of violence, the context in which they experience it, both structurally and importantly historically, often contributed to different circumstances. Namely, they're not often believed stereotypes about women, particularly women who are black, reflect old ideas about black women not being rapeable, black women not being offended, black women being open to any kind of sexual abuse. So when I heard it was Anita, and I'd known her, there weren't a lot of law professors who were black women. So I knew her, and when I saw it was her, I called her on the phone and immediately was talking to the rest of the defense team and just flew there. Didn't tell my mom, didn't tell anyone I was going there. And the little clip where her defense team is walking into the hall. We weren't supposed to be there. We were supposed to be in the back, but one of the ways in which the Judiciary Committee was playing games was that they moved around a lot when she was supposed to testify. So her family was all over DC. So she had to immediately testify when she wasn't supposed to. So basically, everyone who was in the office got rounded up and said to accompany her going into the hearing
Which is
room.
why she says, my family's not here
They're
yet.
not here yet. Exactly. So, it was important to make it clear that she wasn't standing alone. She had people behind her. And so that's how we went in there. My mom was watching it with her students and had no idea I was there. And when she saw me walking out, she about freaked out. She said, "What are you doing and why are you doing it?" But for me, it was, it's hard to capture just how crazy that period was. There were news teams from all over the world. They were crowded all around, inside the Capitol, outside the Capitol. The problem, though, was that on Thomas's side, he had all the Republican senators. He had the White House. He had the Justice Department. And he had large segments eventually of the black community as well. And what happened in outside is that there was always a news pool, right? It was always, so anytime you wanted to make a statement, you would just go up and say something. Well, they were able to shape the coverage because there were endless numbers of people who were going up and making a statement. And all of the statements were pretty much, she's crazy. They were telling, a narrative that she just sat in her home in Oklahoma and decided to make this up, even though the testimony was saying exactly the opposite. It's not a matter of what the truth is. And as this documentary shows, they weren't really interested in getting at the truth. They were just interested in winning the battle. And I didn't understand that until I was there and actually saw it. And I didn't understand why the Democrats, and why Biden in particular, they were doing nothing to help her. So the Republicans were completely on point in being prosecutors. She had no defense. And I didn't get it. I didn't get why they weren't sort of, on her side.
Did you go in with any higher expectations for them? Did you think
Yes.
that Ted Kennedy and Joe Biden were going to do better than they did?
Yes, yes.
Oh.
And the thing about being disillusioned is you don't realize you were illusioned until you lose it. And I remember I was talking. I guess I can say it now. I was talking to Ellie Schmiel. So because the whole framing of the attack on Anita was that it was political, the defense team was really staying away from all of the organizations that had been organized before to try to defeat the confirmation. So it also meant that we didn't really have a sense of what was going on in Washington. So there was a little bit naivete in assuming that the Democrats would do a little bit more than they did. And I remember seeing them, because our little room was right off of their break room. And I remember seeing the Democrats and the Republicans just backslapping each other and having a good old time after they had basically raked her over the coals. And I remember just being upset, just stunned, like you're consorting with the enemy. And Ellie pulled me aside and said, listen, you need to understand, before they're Democrats and Republicans, they're men. That's the fundamental thing, and they're buddies. So
what you're describing is your own version of a part of what the nation saw.
yes.
Which was the view of the monochromatically white male power structure on view on national television, and how it was going to work in unison to discredit this woman. And you were seeing it from inside the room.
Seeing it from inside. Now, where were you seeing it from? Where were you?
Very far from inside the room. I was in my experience of this is much less interesting. I was 16 years old, and I grew up in a left household, a liberal household, very concerned with feminism, having been involved in the civil rights movement and in left economic politics. The weekend of the testimony was a long weekend. I think it was the Columbus Day weekend, and I was on a school holiday, and I happened to be up at the farm that my mother grew up on in northern rural Maine, not with my parents, but with my Republican, conservative, racist grandparents.
Oh.
And they had a picture of Oliver North on the refrigerator.
Oh.
I mean, this is just the context for it. And I was raised in my home steeped in left politics. I went to a very liberal high school, but I watched this on a small television in the kitchen of this farmhouse with my conservative grandparents. And my distinct memory of watching it is being totally glued and listening to my grandparents talk about how she was trying to take him down, and listening to my grandparents talk about how they're trying to bring down this black man, and I'd never heard them express any concern about racial equality. And I would like to impose my adult thinking, but I was confused. I was confused because here were my grandparents who, on some very rudimentary level, I longed to hear talk about race with any curiosity even, right? And so my actual experience of it, I just stayed silent, and it was one of the first experiences that I remember of thinking in my head, am I on the wrong side of this? I didn't know. And I wasn't with anybody who I was having a conversation with where I could sort of talk about what my reaction was. And so I stayed silent, but I remember the experience of not saying all the things I would like to say and being completely perplexed by how this was being received in the room around me. Now, I don't remember anything immediately after. my only experience is remembering this disconnect between what was in my head and what was being said in the room I was in. However, I will say this, and so much of this, I know it, but so much of it came back. You know, within another couple years, I was in college, and I was studying English literature, and I was very interested in issues of gender, bodily autonomy, and sexual harassment, and I did all my sort of academic writing about that as an undergraduate. Then I went into journalism, and I started to write eventually as a feminist journalist, writing very rudimentary feminist commentary about electoral politics. Well, I immediately started writing about, if you write about women in politics in the United States, you write about the Year of the Woman, 1992, in reaction to Anita Hill's testimony. My first book was about the 2008 election and the gendered, racial, and class dynamics of that election, and Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and Sarah Palin, and Michelle Obama's presence in it. Well, of course, in that book, I write about Anita Hill's testimony. When I was on book tour in 2010, Ginny Thomas called. That was what was happening when I was on book tour. My second book was about unmarried women in the United States. And the first story I wanted to tell, and the first person I tried to contact and did and interviewed her for it, was Anita Hill, because she herself had written about how, in addition to her gender and race, one of the things, and her distance from a racial patronage system, the other thing that made her incomprehensible to that Senate Judiciary Committee was her lack of attachment to marriage, the institution that had organized power in the United States around gender. And so I talked to her about that, and for that book I went back and watched all the testimony again. My most recent book is about anger and women's anger and the forms of anger that are encouraged and taken seriously and the expressions of anger that are discouraged. Again, I'm writing about Anita Hill. And when this book was published, it was the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. And so what I think about and at this point, this is, now 26, 7 years, it's like a boomerang back to that, the things that couldn't come out of my head in the farm kitchen when I was 16, it's like I have spent my entire career boomeranging back, trying to pull apart all that confusion that I was feeling. And this has been the story through which I have learned and tried to grow in my analysis and thinking about what was going on in that room, on the television, in the room I was sitting in my head, and in the country. And this is the thing I've returned to again and again. And of course, a lot of that has been about deepening and complicating the set of lessons that were drawn. Because I think at first, and especially when I think of my early writing, which was about the gendered politics of what was going on, with almost no racial analysis. And I think that was a framework that was encouraged for a long time. That this was a story about women. Women. You have always known that that was not the story, or not the full story.
Not the whole story.
Right.
Yeah, and that frame was, I call it colorblind feminism. That framework, first of all, obscured much of what was happening. It obscured why, when Clarence Thomas did the high-tech lynching move, why it was so effective. And it particularly obscured the ways in which we have something called, I call it asymmetric solidarity. Like when he was able to say, this is a high-tech lynching for Black men who think for themselves. He is able at that moment to galvanize the support that comes from making a claim that something is racist and use it for his own benefit and basically pull the racial solidarity rug away from Anita Hill. So she's basically figured not as another Black woman, but just woman, red default, white woman. And so the racial politics are not they're not named and they're not contested. So my recognition about how deep this is was while we were there. And the night that the testimony happened, many of us who were on her team left the Capitol really late. And the Capitol was still abuzz. There were a lot of people. And we saw and heard a group of African American women. And we thought, they've showed up. The team is here. So we go walking off to, sort of join forces and find, the support team for her. And as we get closer, we hear that there's prayers going up. We're like, okay, we can work with that. She could use some prayers right now. And we get a little closer, and then we start hearing, like, the prayers are not for her. The prayers are actually against her. And they are basically endorsing the framework on her that the Judiciary Committee was already articulating. Save Clarence Thomas from this evil, deliver him, from this woman, take care of your servant. I mean, it was like a Twilight Zone moment for me. It really did feel like that. And then we took off and got into a taxi. And the taxi driver, Washington D.C., black taxi driver, he's from the diaspora, African driver. He's got the talk shows on. People are calling in, black people, talk show, talking about who is this woman. She should be shot. Just basically really ripping her apart. And it's a diasporic sensibility. I mean, he was wildly gesticulating as well. So there was a kind of fundamental reaction to both his claim that he was a lynch victim and that she was basically being a traitor to the race to speak about what happened. So this is going on in the African American community. Feminists, on the other hand, were saying, it doesn't have anything to do with race. Well, that's not really helping the situation. It has a lot to do with race. The way she was being grilled had a lot to do with race. His ability to throw down that card and them not come to her defense has a lot to do with race. So colorblind feminism helped create this chasm. So you had anti-racism here, you had colorblind feminism there, and the fact that black women had created sexual harassment law just fell right through the cracks.
Right. The thing, when I think about the way that he deployed the argument about lynching,
Yes.
and the anger in response to it. And one thing I had said, I hadn't seen this documentary since it was in the theaters. And so I had not gone back and watched this documentary since, or had been reminded of his demeanor. I remember the lines, but I didn't remember his demeanor.
Clenched teeth.
The snarling,
Yeah.
and I had not remembered it since I wrote a book about anger. I wrote and the expression of anger and who's permitted to express it and how the expression of anger intersects with who has power in a given situation and on whose behalf you're being angry. And so, and I hadn't seen it obviously since Brett Kavanaugh's testimony.
Yeah.
And one of the things that struck me so profoundly is that he was able to do the thing that Anita Hill could not do.
Right.
Anita Hill had to be precise, polite, even-toned, solicitous. The idea that she was already treated as a disruptive and violent,
Disorderly
body.
Yeah.
And so everything in her tone and demeanor had to be restrained, controlled, and unthreatening. And for those of you who have memories of the past 6 months, that will probably be familiar.
Let's help them see
Right.
that.
No, there he is. He looks like an angry weasel. and but thinking about because I think about who gets to express this kind of anger. So ordinarily, anger about the history of racist violence against black men, often truly in response to false claims of sexual harassment or assault, historically often made by white women.
Yes, historically.
That's not the kind of thing that gets a lot of support from white Republicans in Congress.
Yeah.
And that's a really listening to his anger in response to the real history of racist violence and diminishment in this country get kind of applauded. I mean, approved of. Made me think about when is that anger permissible and sort of and welcomed by a fundamentally conservative white patriarchal governing body? Well, when it's in defense of that white patriarchal conservatism, right? And that's really instructive when we think, because often it's like, oh, who's allowed to be, it's also on behalf of what are you allowed to express and encouraged to express your righteous rage. And so if your righteous rage at systemic racism is in fact expressed on behalf of a further accrual of fundamentally white patriarchal conservative capitalist power, that's cool. Right?
Very, very cool.
Right.
It worked. Now, the question I guess we might want to ask ourselves is what happened between the 91 and 2018, right? So, number one, as you pointed out, it created the Year of the Woman. Women went into politics like never before. Their anger drove political participation. Emily's List came into being and into its own largely as a response to this, right? Sexual harassment became a thing that people finally
Part
knew
of the
about,
lexicon,
right?
yes.
There were trainings, right? There's laws, there's regulations, there's new ways of thinking and talking about accountability, and then we get to this guy.
Can I make an argument about one particular tactical thing that happened between 1991
Okay. Yeah.
and 2016/2018? Clarence Thomas was confirmed to the Supreme Court, where he helped to gut the Voting Rights Act, which in turn helped to elect Donald Trump to the presidency despite having had credible claims of harassment and assault made against him 1 month before the election. So you can draw the kind of long-term results of this, in part, like the degrees to which they take us directly to this moment are strong in multiple directions.
So let me add to that, right? So one of the pieces that came out in the New York Times after the Clarence Thomas hearing, after he was affirmed, was a piece by Orlando Patterson, who is an academic at Harvard. He made the claim that even if factually Anita was telling the truth about the banter, the pubic hair on the Coke can, she was effectively lying because what she was experiencing was simply down-home courting. Is basically just the way black people talk to each other. And she was pretending to be offended by it, basically giving herself over to white women's puritanical feeling about sex. So basically it was like a real black woman would have put him in his place. You are a real black woman, so for you to not put him in his place and then go to complain about it means that you're basically acting white. Now, what I found so fascinating about this was, number one, of all the different things that the New York Times could have printed, you know, in the aftermath, I mean, people were writing all kinds of things. This was the thing that they chose. This is what they thought was an interesting spin on what you American public just saw. What they didn't think was important to pay attention to is what Black women were actually saying. What had fallen between the cracks. So because there was so little space for Black women to actually talk about what happened, 1,800 Black women actually raised $50,000 back in the days before the internet and before Color of Change, before Move On, where you, to really do a petition, you actually had to sign something, you had to fax something, you had to mail it. So all of these women created this ad called African American Women in Defense of Ourselves, in which the entire history of Black women being marginalized, not being able to defend themselves, being caught between a colorblind feminism and a patriarchal anti-racism had created this particular moment. That has fallen outside of the history and the memory of this. It didn't get much attention in at the conference. It wasn't explicitly mentioned in any of the memories that we've been seeing of it. And that's had consequences. Here are the consequences. So yes, Clarence Thomas becomes the fifth vote, not only to gut voting rights, but to gut campaign finance reform, to gut affirmative action. We can list all of the rules that the Supreme Court has contributed to making the current crisis that we have.
He has been a deciding vote in cases that made it
Over
more
and
difficult to bring sexual harassment
These
claims.
very claims. So when we're in conversations about how terrible this moment is, one of the things that I frequently say to African Americans who supported him and my feminist friends who couldn't figure out how to not further polarize this by saying it didn't have anything to do with race is to say, this particular debacle is why we're here. So have we done any better in dealing with it? Have we done any better? So here's a parallel. Black women actually created sexual harassment law. Michelle Vincent, Sandra Bundy, Pamela Price. These are all Black women who were plaintiffs in the first sexual harassment cases.
And Eleanor Holmes Norton, who was doing the legal work.
In charge, exactly, of the commission. So this is largely Black women saying, I see this for what it is. This isn't about you just want to date me. This is your expression of power over me.
And it came out of some of the law that had been made within a civil rights movement. They were, in part, thinking about definitions of discrimination that had come out of legal thinking and laws made during and in the wake of the civil rights movement and applying them to gender. In fact, suggesting from their experiences around racial discrimination that we could think differently about how gender discrimination works and how we might better protect ourselves and defend against it.
And part of that is Black women saying the personal is, here's my personal that's political. I see my brothers recognizing that the personal dimension of racism, like don't call me boy, don't emasculate me. This was very much part of the civil rights movement. So the way Black women experienced discrimination as Black women was often through sexual abuse. Right. I mean, sexual abuse was institutionalized. It was called slavery. Right. So it's basically been a part of Black women's history from the beginning. So what comes back to Black women for having done that? We get to this moment where we have Me Too.
Which, Me Too, which in its original form,
yes,
is founded by Tarana Burke, a Black woman who is speaking and creating a movement around the personal being political, encouraging speech and communication and the telling of stories, specifically about sexual violence in communities of color, women and girls of color. in 2006.
And so where are women and girls of color in Me Too?
And this is the crucial question, because what breaks through in the hashtag Me Too movement? They are the stories, very real stories about very real violence and assault, but they are the stories often of white women, white wealthy women. We have just seen in recent weeks how long it took for the stories about black women and girls who for years had experienced assault, coercion by R. Kelly. And the telling of that story had attracted far less attention than the stories of some of the white women. And you see and one of the things that I have been thinking about and learning, and it also returns us to the question of Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, is that one of the lessons of the past couple of years, and the way that white women, often middle-class white women, or wealthy white women, women who have gotten to the top of the kind of power structures that have historically not made room for them, are nonetheless thrown under the bus by patriarchy, and that the view of that is part of what has awakened at least a segment of the population that has been kind of somnambulant for a long time. And so it's that view, I did a lot of thinking listening to Christine Blasey Ford's testimony about the fact that she was all those things that Anita Hill was all too aware she was not. This was a white woman from an elite background. She was married. And yet, she was not believed, she was not heard, or she was believed. It's just they didn't care.
I think they believed her.
Yeah, I think they believed her too. And that's the thing and that's in part the Orlando Patterson thing. Yeah, sure, this happened.
But it doesn't matter.
But it doesn't matter. Your experience of it as unacceptable, coercive, traumatic, doesn't count, because we're imposing a view of what should be acceptable in your lives.
So the question is now, whether this awakening, whether this, reckoning, will unfold in the same way that the awakening did in 91. Okay. Because women did see in the treatment of Anita Hill the disregard for women. But that consciousness only goes to the fork in the road. Mm-hmm. So the fork in the road is, I will ride along with you as long as the way we're experiencing this is recognizably the same.
Right.
But when the fork in the road happens, where there's a race dimension, or a gender identity dimension, or a religious dimension, or immigrant dimension, when women's experience becomes diversified by other power relations, that fork in the road often means that white middle-class women not only say, okay, I'm not going down this fork in the road, they actually tell us to get out of the car, even though it's our car.
Right.
So the question is, have we gotten to a point where we have the capacity to mobilize this anger in a way that acknowledges, yes, Christine Blasey Ford got treated with disregard and disrespect, and that is telling us something about what Kate Mann says, empathy, right? There's all of this, when a man gets mad, and Lord have mercy, when a man starts to cry, then the game is over, right? It doesn't matter how sympathetic, how truthful people think. The man's tears, they're magic. They end everything. So we know, we see this dynamic. This much is true. But the question is, what needs to happen so that doesn't become the excuse for a feminism that says, well, as long as we understand this dimension, collectively we'll stick together. But when you're asking me to pick up another language and go an additional mile, then that's not about feminism. That's not about women.
Right.
That's about people of color, and that's about immigrants, and that's about Muslims. Well, yeah, immigrant women, Muslim women. So we have to figure out what we need to do now to galvanize and keep this anger and turn capacity into this anger.
And I believe that in part that too is about anger within coalitions.
Yeah.
And the value of anger. So a lot of what we're talking about is the anger of progressive coalitions, anger of people who've been marginalized or made vulnerable, oppressed, or subjugated at the power structure. But there's also anger within the coalitions that exist. And that's true in every progressive coalition. This is not something that's just true of women's movements, though it has been true of the women's movement in the United States in every one of its iterations, that it has been plagued by racism, classism, homophobia. It is also true, it has also been true of the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, the labor movement. Right. So, but the challenge in front of an iteration of a women's movement, however broadly you want to define that in this moment, I think is to not only find common anger at the inequities of a power structure, but to value the internal anger, listen to it, do what Audre Lorde has suggested, you know, in The Uses of Anger, 1981 essay, in which she argues that the anger between allies, specifically the anger between black and white feminist peers over racism within their coalition, is generative. That it is necessary to talk through the resentments, not talk through and get over them, but to express the resentments, make clear the inequities, and to move forward from there to a stronger coalition. So I think too often the anger between allies gets written off as, oh, it's divisive and we need to form a unified front.
Or it's women just being catty.
Or it's women backstabby, right? Like pillow fighting, pulling hair. Women aren't nice to each other. But in fact, what Audre Lorde has always seen, what you see, what is the value of listening to the anger, even if that anger is coming at you, by which I mean me, by which I, you know, like that anger is itself part of the building block of moving forward, and pretending that it doesn't exist makes a weaker coalition, not a stronger one.
So you guys ready to get in on this conversation? All right, I think we have a mic here and a mic here. Maybe we can take two at a time.
Hello, my name is Platan Largan, and I'm very curious about your take on Kobe Bryant still being able to function as an icon in pop culture, and also not too many public attacks being launched at him. Not only for just being accused, by actually admitting that he has raped a young female.
I guess my question is about, like, with all of the changes that are not really being communicated but are being put into action around Title IX on college campuses in California already, but also like across the nation, like what sort of like pathways you all can draw about coming from like Anita Hill and the Kavanaugh hearings, but also just about like where do we as like college students go from here, and like utilizing the anger of like this affects everyone, and that like at like our campus at Cal Poly SLO, it's like predominantly white and affluent and things like that, and that like there's so much like space for like all of us being pissed off about like sexual assault and sexual violence and things like that, but that like how do we mobilize in our campus and in our community when like not even the people that are white affluent women are being like believed, just like Christine Blasey Ford.
So I guess I'll start with the Kobe. I mean, well, first of all, I didn't know myself that he admitted to it. So that's news to me. And
Well, he claims it was consensual.
Yeah, so that's what so I didn't know that he had admitted that it wasn't. But I mean, I guess I want to ask why are we surprised by that? I mean, there are a lot of people who have been accused of sexual assault and haven't lost their popularity, have been able, to move in and out of spaces, particularly celebrities, particularly sports heroes. I think it would be more surprising if he didn't. So sometimes I think that because we have a sense of what things should be, the question is, well, why is that? We've been talking about gender power for a half hour. That's a product of it. I don't know what more to say than that's part of the problem.
And it's in part the answer to all these. I mean, I was struck watching this again, all the questions about why didn't you get angry? Why didn't you tell somebody? Why didn't you file your complaint? It's like, right, she lives in the world is why. Because every message, and that's asked every single time, it's an amazing trap that's set up. Yeah. That Donald Trump gets elected president a month after he's caught on tape talking about grabbing women by the pussy. And then the question is, well, why didn't you come out and complain? Because, right, because I live here. I have ears and eyes, right? That dude got elected president, and he was on tape. There was no denying it.
Yes.
And also, so the notion, I think you're exactly right, that the bigger surprise is when there are consequences. And that is really new. Like it's like the last 5 minutes that there have been consequences. Mm-hmm. And they're not actually, they're not for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I'm trying to think of something different to say about the Title IX other than elections have consequences. We knew when he this is the second part of the story. A man who grabbed pussies got elected president of the United States. He was able to appoint people who were on point with him, including a woman who was on point with him, including his representative, who basically uses feminism as a way of garnering more support for him. I mean, it is the situation that I think drove so many women into the streets. I just hope that level of righteous indignation about it continues. We've got 2 more years in which the possibility that steam gets lost, the fact that it's such a shit show. I mean, everything is happening, so it's almost hard to, there's a fire here, fire there. It is sort of the shock and awe approach to gender repression. And so our strategy has to at least be, I think we need to be literate in all the different sites that this is happening in, and also supportive. But we're dealing with all sorts of stuff. So I'm dealing with stuff that's happening at the court level, dealing with the fact that a Supreme Court seat was stolen, and the Supreme Court is now in the hands of right-wingers for the rest of my life. I hope not the rest of your life. So trying to manage the outcomes of that, raising the awareness of the American public. The unfortunate thing is that this problem with the courts just hasn't been part of the democratic progressive discourse for a generation. And the consequence is that even if we win political battles at Congress or in the state courts, these federal courts are in the position to overturn even what we win there. So we've got big fights ahead. They're connected, and the importance is being able to articulate where they're connected and how the energy we put into one can be leveraged into the other. But frankly, it's like the California fires. It's happening everywhere right now.
And I think that goes back to your question about how do we move forward? What are the key things we need to do moving forward that don't replicate errors of a progressive past? And one of them is to better integrate the real, mechanical understanding of what the right wing in this country is not only trying to do, but is succeeding in doing. Yes. Because in having those mechanisms at the top, what they are doing, it's not like coincidental and it's not random. They are dismantling the mechanisms by which those with less power, the masses, have to make change. They're dismantling the progress that was done by centuries, generations of mass movements that got us to a Voting Rights Act, that got us to collective bargaining rights, that got us to affirmative action, that got us to reproductive autonomy. When they got those things, they are reversing generations worth of social progress and doing so in a way that is meant to quell the future power of mass movements. So that if you actually strip voting rights and you suppress an electorate, then you remove the power of the masses to be represented, to advocate for themselves, to make the laws, to be in a position to appoint the judges. And that's the system, the machine we're caught in right now. And that is why there is the investment in Clarence Thomas and Donald Trump and Brett Kavanaugh, is to fix the top systems so that the bottom has nowhere to go.
Hi, good evening. Are you aware of any organizations that have popped up since the 2016 election that specifically organized, not necessarily around the model of the Heritage Foundation, but particularly working to get more progressives on the court? And if so, could you share any names or of people or organizations that are working in that direction? Sort of. Thank you.
And let's get another one.
Hi.
Oh, there you are.
On the topic of race being a divisive issue in the feminist movement, I'm wondering if you could speak on the Women's March. I know recently they have divided into 2 women's marches, and I'm wondering how you guys advise Women's March supporters to shape how that movement goes forward.
I'll take the first question. So the short of it is there's nothing that matches the Federalist Society. The Federalist Society is, I think now the majority of the members in the Supreme Court have ties to the Federalist Society. The justice, the attorneys general all are part of it. It is a conservative organization that has deep roots throughout all of the Republican administrations. They vet the judges before they're even appointed. It is a pipeline that's like, an oil pipeline. It's deeply valuable. It's got a lot of people in it. Yet if you're in it, your chances of actually getting appointed are significantly greater than if you're not in it. It is a right-wing project. It's been around for over 30 years. It is part of the reason why the federal judiciary is now leaning to the right. It's the reason why the Supreme Court is a right-wing Supreme Court now. Now imagine what would have happened if something like the National Law Guild had been in the position to vet all judges, all appointees in the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, what was left of the Carter administration. The problem is that didn't happen. There's no balance between the two. There's no sense that this needs to be corrected. The Obama administration didn't really prioritize, let's say, judicial appointments. So let me just give you one example. Thurgood Marshall, who is the justice that Clarence Thomas replaced, probably could not have gotten appointed even in the Obama administration. I mean, just think about this. right? Being a lawyer for a social justice organization, being an advocate for civil rights, being the person, the architect behind the attack on segregation, these are all the things that would have made him appear to be a left-wing partisan. And those folks did not get appointed, again, even by the Democrats. Sotomayor almost didn't get appointed, and that was because she had spent a couple of years working for Pearl Death. Mainly, she was a corporate lawyer. So the balance has changed significantly, and one of the reasons it's changed is liberals don't have arguments in response to the arguments on the right, which is we've got activist courts, they've destroyed our democracy, they've turned everything upside down, and we have to fix it. Our folks just say, well, no, we don't have activists, rather than actually making arguments substantively supporting much of what the Warren Court did. And so until we can understand and talk about the courts in ways that shape our lives, we're going to continue to lose this battle. So for those of you who are looking for some way to right the wrong, invest your attention and resources in efforts to try to take back the court. It was a 50-year strategy, and they've won. And now we're going to have a strategy that's equally long-term to win it back.
I'm doing the Women's March question, I think. Yay. Actually, okay, so I do have a lot of thoughts on the Women's March. And they extend back to the first Women's March, which in its earliest form, and it took its earliest form the night of the election, in which two women separately, one in Hawaii and one in New York, sort of said, two white women said on Facebook, we should have a women's march. We're so mad, we should have a women's march. And they woke up the next morning and they each had tens of thousands of responses. And so the march, it's in its original form, is conceived of and originally planned by two white women on the night of an election in which exit polls show that 52% of white women voted for Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton, and 94% of African American women voted for Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump. And one of the earliest things they do is decide to call this march the Million Woman March, with no apparent knowledge of or curiosity about the fact that the Million Woman March was a 1997 Philadelphia event of 500,000 African American women. So the first part of this, of what becomes the Women's March, threatens to repeat all the worst history of earlier iterations of a women's movement and become just an appropriative morass of newly awakened white female anger in the wake of an election in which white women were substantially responsible for the result. So women come in, three women organizers come in from other movements. They do not come in from movements we think of as explicitly women's movements. Linda Sarsour, Tamika Mallory, Carmen Perez. And they come in to organize this march, and to do so with the explicit intention of addressing the racial inequities and the ideological chasms that are present in the original form of the march. And they encourage, and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, and my belief that the encouragement of address of these issues is the way forward and is the generative way forward, not the divisive and destructive and diminishing way, but in fact the way to strengthen, build, and improve on a coalition that may form around moving closer toward equality and liberation for more people. And they insist that there is discussion about racism, about homophobia, transphobia. They insist that this march is not just going to be about a view of women's issues that have in recent years been defined largely by white middle class women around reproductive reproductive rights, not even reproductive justice. This is going to be a movement about reproductive justice, about economic inequality, about indigenous rights, about environmental racism. And in doing that, there is, if you go back to the coverage from before the first Women's March and look at the New York Times, the anxiety is this is too divisive, right? The disruptive bodies are the women of color who are coming in and insisting on these very difficult conversations around race, and white women are being driven off. And the stories in the New York Times are like, you know, a white woman in North Carolina who was going to come to the Women's March, but now that she's being pressed on racism and her complicity and her adjacency to white supremacy and her own white supremacy, she's put off and she's not going to come. And the anxiety was this is going to dissolve what could have been a large gathering. And yet, what the organizers say, and Linda Sarsour said at the time, contentious dialogue is by design. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it better than we've done it in the past, and that involves having these fights, exposing the resentments, exposing the frustrations and the anger within the coalition. And that march is the single biggest one-day political protest in the country's history. So that contentious dialogue does not work to diminish engagement. And in fact, what you get is a protest, and it's not that everybody there was signing up for the full, like a lot of people were showing up for their very, slim reasons. But it sets a tone for what is possible as we move forward. Now, part of what happens now, and part of what is that call for examination of bias, it also ensnares some of the people who are in the organizing coalition. And so there is an active conversation now around Tamika Mallory's connection to the Nation of Islam. And, her refusal to disavow her relationship to Louis Farrakhan. Now, part of what I have gained from reading about this is a much better understanding of the history of anti-Semitism in some progressive black communities, the history of racism within Jewish communities. I have learned a lot about the tangled roots of resentment. I do not, to me, it does not make sense. There's the other element of this is that while the Women's March as a convening event, and one which I again believe set the tone for what we are called to do moving forward as a coalition, the Women's March and its national organizing structure does not represent the women's movement. It created one event. There was a second event that actually wasn't organized by those leaders to begin. They were doing a Get Out the Vote in the second year, and it was all local marches that gathered last in 2018. And in some cities, it was bigger than the first year. And there's a way in which there's a desire to portray that difficult conversation and the expression of anger between allies as a sign that the energies of the Women's March are fading. But in fact, the sign of the energies of the Women's March are in the teacher strikes. They're in the historic number of women running for office and winning office. They're in the airport protests that happened a week after. They're in the #MeToo movement. They're in the R. Kelly documentary. They're in the protests against the child separation policy. What that event did was offer a convening and a signal and a view of anger that could be complex and hard and still bring people together to the same space with the view of working together in a number of different directions. And so my view of the Women's March as an annual event is it never needed to happen every year. That the Women's March organization is not the driving organizational force of progressivism and women-led progressivism right now. And that we should be very wary of calls to renounce the Women's March or use it to determine the health of a contemporary women's movement. And that if you are moved to gather next year, or if you were moved to gather 2 weeks ago, that you should go gather. And that it's not about the leadership, and it's about being part of this hard conversation and that part of what those leaders, even those who are now caught up in their own hard conversations, did was create space for people to come together in both coalition and dissent. And that is the call of the moment, and I hope continues to be the call of the future.
So you've got your marching orders. So I think we're about out of time, right?
Still have a question on this side.
Yeah, there are a lot of people who've been waiting, but we're going to be outside. Let me say that in terms of annual, you heard earlier Claudia mentioned that we're going to have a week called Her Dream Deferred, which is part of activation around women. So it will be a week last week in March focusing on the social economic status of Black women, and we're going to talk about political mobilization. We're going to talk about Say Her Name, and we hope you guys come back for that. So thank you all very much.